was fun. Anyway, so tonight, we're continuing on in this kind of series that we've been doing of just like talking about the kinds of afflictions of the soul and the mind. And tonight, it's not about something that in itself is inherently bad. It's just more of how it can be used, how it becomes a negative. Like, basically the thing of it is that we all understand, it's oftentimes stated that Satan is not capable of creation. Rather, what he's capable of doing, what sin typically is something that is good that has been twisted. Some form of twist, some form of something. To murder is to take life rather than give life. To steal is to take what is not yours instead of asking for it. There are a lot of different things that come out of these places where it's like, to take something that's yours is fine, but this is just taking something that's somebody else's. So twist, that little bit of twist. And in that way, a lot of good things can become problematic, can become broken. And the same is true with this particular subject tonight, which is conditioning. Now, in the scriptures, we see a lot of things that highlight, that point to like good conditioning. For example, in Proverbs 22, the all too familiar verse about raising up a child, start children off on the way they should go, and even when they are old, they will not turn from it. In that proverb, they're specifically just highlighting the idea that, look, raise your kids in such a way, raise them the right way, and they won't break from that when they get older. They'll stick to that. Another example, is closer, or is close in the scriptures, that can allude to conditioning. As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. Just the whole concept of we build each other, we condition each other. See, conditioning in and of itself, it's not necessarily a bad thing. To condition oneself, to be conditioned, all that means is that you're either being taught, you're being groomed, you're being built, you're being set up, you're developing yourself. To exercise is to condition yourself. To teach your child is to condition your child. These are all components of how to develop ourselves in such a way so as to better be able to survive in the world around us. For example, as like, one of the grand arguments against like helicopter parenting is that the children end up not being conditioned to handle complications as they arise. So parents, in a bid to protect their children, isolate their children from anything that could be problematic, and as such the children do not learn how to handle that. So you end up with a lot of situations where you have like the typical story of like the good Christian family who protects their kids from all of the sin of the world, and then when their kid, for whatever reason, has to go out into that world, they don't have any form of conditioning towards it. So when presented with things that would tear them apart, they just say, oh, yeah, sure, we'll try that. My parents said I was never supposed to do this, but they're not here anymore, so why not? and that's one thing. But our purpose is not to, even though conditioning can have its good side, its good use, its beneficial parts, it can also have a negative connotation. If you can condition yourself to strengthen yourself, or if you can be conditioned to be stronger, you can also be conditioned to be weaker. You can also be conditioned to be set up to fail. And this is where we get into one of the things, like we have talked over the course of the past several weeks, we've talked about things like depression. We've talked about things like trauma. We've talked about things like Dunning-Kruger effect. And in all those cases, these are things that oftentimes can be fostered by conditioning that lead us down one sort of perspective or series of beliefs. And it's not even just that. I just recently learned about the Pygmalion Effect, which is the idea of the way that we interact with each other in generating perspectives about ourselves and each other. So if you take, say, the example that was given was of a basketball coach, and he has one player who he reminds him of like a great athlete, and there's another player who reminds him of this kid that used to annoy him back when he was in school. So he invests more time and energy into that kid who he reminds him of that star athlete, and is less interested in the kid who reminds him of the annoying kid. And as a result, the kid with more attention and more effort being put into him, he develops and he grows and he believes in himself, and he develops into a great basketball player, or even just a functional basketball player with confidence and so on. Whereas the other one, who doesn't have that effort and belief put into them, doesn't. He feels neglected, he feels unwanted, he loses interest in playing and so on. And in that regard, that reinforces the belief of the coach that, oh yeah, I already figured he was going to be like that. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that regard. And that's something that can affect us. Like, we can be conditioned by our circumstances and our experiences. 9 times out of 10, when you see people fighting about things on like Facebook or anywhere, the argument comes down to their experience versus what might be stated as a reality. You'll have like some group of scientists put out a piece of information saying like, 80% of people struggle with learning this particular thing, and you'll have that one person who pipes up and is like, well, I had a really easy time learning that. In that case, they're speaking from their experience, not from any collective understanding of everyone else's experiences. So what they're purely presenting is their interpretation of facts based on what their life has looked like. And this is where a lot of conditioning comes from. Conditioning, in any case, in this particular context, tends to be the quantum of our life experiences pushing us in a direction, pushing us in a perspective, pushing us in a belief system that may or may not be conducive to living as functional people, or even especially to being followers of Jesus. And this is where we end up with a lot of dysfunction, as our conditioning, even the entire concept of trauma, when we talked about that, we talked about the way that it like alters brain pathways. Literally, your trauma has conditioned you to function a certain way. your brain is hardwired to go this way now. It's like it's closed the walls into this one particular way of doing things. And that's the only way that you can contrive to do it. So as a result, there you are. You're faced with this difficult thing, and it's like you can't even think outside of this one particular way that, though it might cause you to survive the situation, it also comes at significant cost. So, he's just looking at you so indignantly right now, isn't he? He's just like, why did you do that?
Yes,
Yeah. And he goes back to sleep. And snoring immediately. There he is. That's Harley.
I kind of wondered if that would happen.
Mm-hmm.
Put a CPAP on this dog.
So anyway, the big thing about it is when we have this kind of negative conditioning, and it doesn't, it's not just life experience. There are other things that come into play as well. One thing when I was like preparing for this message, praying about it and different things like that, God had reminded me of past conversations where we've talked about spiritual warfare and how we've talked about spiritual assignments and also familiar spirits. Assignments being like a sort of spiritual attack where the enemy has a very focused and specific attack that they want to press forward on you. And they'll press it on again and again and again and again and again, using other people, using any situation they can in order to foster that, a false perspective, and condition you to believe that this is the way things are. An example that comes right to mind is a personal one, which was I had an assignment on myself for a very long time to be a voice calling out in the wilderness, which was basically this thing of like, the way it was described to me was you're stuck being that guy who's always like speaking on things that you're very much right, but nobody's listening. And that's your kind of lot in life, the kind of curse that you bear. And in the end, that was an assignment that was put in place to like try to silence me. And these are the kinds of things that they do, whether your assignment is something like people always believing that you're a liar for no reason. You could be the most honest person in the world, and for whatever reason, people are always accusing you of lying. You could be a very humble person, and for whatever reason, everybody always thinks that you're arrogant. And there's no reason why. There's nothing that you're doing necessarily. Everything that you can think of, everything that you can perceive has you being humble and not being that person. But for some reason, some inexplicable reason, everyone always jumps to that.
It's like false identity.
Exactly. It's like a false identity that other people perceive that you don't carry. That's oftentimes what we describe as an assignment, and what this is designed to do is to affect your perception of yourself, to make you believe that false identity, and to kind of throw you into chaos so that, you'll fall into it, or you'll slip into it, or even to generate a sort of false Pygmalion effect where you start thinking that you are that person, and more as time passes and you face it again and again and again, you start to just believe that's you. You're an honest person who thinks they're a liar. You never lie. ever for any reason, and yet you feel like you're a liar because you've been conditioned to believe that you are. And that's the point. And of course there's other things that come with that, like that's a spiritual attack, but it can also be like something that happens because when we talk about conditioning, we also have to talk about like emotional manipulation and the kind of psychological and gaslighting and the different things that people do to cause those kinds of effects on each other. The kinds of abuses that are visited upon us, as kids, adults, whatever, be it from a parent, bad relationship, a bad situation, whatever it is. Even a bad friends group can do that kind of a thing and push those certain buttons. So it doesn't even necessarily have to be like, the demons conspired to paint this picture of you. It can just be, your crappy parent who has their own significant psychological problems, bestowing upon you the gift of more psychological problems and really fostering that in you, conditioning you to carry around that kind of stuff. Like when we talked about narcissists are great for generating that particular problem. They'll condition people to believe certain things, to feel certain things. And we talked about that in that message, talking about the way that a lot of people who are raised by narcissistic parents or have narcissistic long-term relationships, they'll find themselves becoming like people pleasers, always looking to like cater to somebody else, to build them up, to develop them, because that's what they've been conditioned to do by that narcissist who manipulated them and used them. In that same vein, another thing that I was reminded of was in the spiritual warfare realm, which was familiar spirits, which are the spirits that are assigned to a family to kind of foster a certain repetitive problem. It's why you'll find people who have like a history of drinking in their family or a history of cheating. That was another one that I'd seen with people. There was one pastor over at Bridgetown, and she talked about generational curses. And she was talking about praying those off of ourselves. And the thing about familiar spirits and generational curses is that they can go hand in hand. You could use them interchangeably oftentimes. Whether it's a demon that has been assigned to like linger around your family to the point that you're conditioned to not even recognize that it's a problem, or it's a generational curse, which is like a continuous problem. They're oftentimes associated with one another. One is usually if there's a demon there, they're building that particular problem and building to it. And even to the point of like conditioning you to believe that you're no better than your family members who had that problem prior. And in the case of this particular pastor, she was talking about how when she did like a study on her family, she learned that her mom had cheated on her dad, and her grandma had cheated on her grandpa, and her great-grandma had cheated on her great-grandpa, and that there was this continuous history going generations back of cheating, and she herself, having just gotten married, found that very alarming. And maybe there were certain mentalities that she had that would make it easy to do that, some form of justification or something like that. So she had to kind of explore that and found herself praying about that, because that's the thing. The thing about this kind of conditioning is that it's little things all put together that you don't see. To kind of like give an example here, just to kind of branch off the cheating example, right? Like, you yourself might sit there and say, like, I would never cheat because I think that's horrible. Okay? But if your partner was neglectful, would you stick around? Well, no, because why would I stick around with somebody who doesn't care about me? Okay, that's one small piece. And for a lot of people that sounds valid. But then you attach another little piece to it, which says, you should take what you need, and you should take stock of what you need. And sex is a need, so you shouldn't deprive yourself of your needs. Okay, so you start believing that. And you can see how the two can be intersected to build slowly this kind of mentality that would generate that kind of a thing. That's the kind of conditioning that can come from a familiar spirit, because it breaks into those little things, those little crevices in our armor that we don't even see, because it's been there with us since we were just tiny babies. It's been there with our parents. It's been there with our grandparents. So it becomes this thing of like, it's why for a lot of us, it's why when we've talked about like family, talking about all the psychological stuff and about the struggles with faith and so on, something about families and the way that when we were with our families, it's like they can find the chinks in our armor and just get through so easily. They just know how to hurt us. They know how to hit us in a certain way. Well, that's all tied in together. And that's the thing, is like, it's just this level of conditioning that's like starting when you're a baby and continuing on. That's the nature of, of the enemy in our circumstances of spiritual warfare. Mm-hmm. Satan is more than, like, I don't know, like, where people get the idea that, like, Satan is not patient or anything like that. Like, a lot of people paint him as being very impulsive, and it's like, that's not true. Satan's borderline, like, psychopathic in his, like, level of patience and commitment to a plan. So, yeah, he will, like, lay out a plan and try to see it done. Because, in essence, he's trying to emulate God, and that's more important to him than getting what he wants right now. Beyond that, in a similar vein, you can run into genetics and having a genetic predisposition towards certain behaviors, certain things. A lot of times, like with alcohol abuse and drug use, you can have a genetic disposition towards those things as a result of just a family heritage. And in that particular thing, the thing about genetics is that a lot of genetics comes down to how they're expressed. So the way that you treat your body, the way that you live, can impact the expression of your genes. It's not purely what you're born with. Especially by the time you hit about like 35 or so, I think it was, where your entire body has already gone through like a full cellular rejuvenation, in the sense that, all of your cells have like died and reproduced at that point in time. So you basically are like a new person in this regard. Some people will find that the expression of their genes is different at that point in time. So we have a lot of different things that can kind of lend themselves towards conditioning us in certain ways. And the thing about it is that in these particular instances, as they condition us, what they're effectively doing is they're just bringing the walls in closer and closer and closer to generate a narrower and narrower path of how to live and think and act. And even in what to believe. Like, when you think about it, how many Christians do you know who talk about miraculous things from God but don't believe in them? And it's not even just that they don't believe in them, they just don't believe in them for themselves. You know, they sit there and they might talk about people being healed. They might talk about how God can do whatever he wants. And then when they have a problem, they're like, I have to fix this. And it's like, well, why don't you ask God to do it? Well, God's not going to help me. Why would God not help you? You're always telling everyone else to pray for help. Yeah, but that's different. That's them. Why is that different? Because it's different. God will help them. He's not going to help me. Why would God not help you? Because he wouldn't. Do you have an actual reason why? No, of course not. Because all that you have is that your conditioning tells you that you are to expect less, that you are to not have everything. See, the funny thing about it is, like, when we take a step back and look at it, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ was done for everybody. Everybody was offered the same grace, the same Holy Spirit, the same blessing, the same everything. The gift was simple, and it was the same for all of us. However, we get it in our heads that that's not true. We can believe for other people much more easily than we can believe for ourselves. And again, we're conditioned to believe that way. I can't remember which point we talked about it, but the whole point about, like, the conditioning of the church that incidentally, it's not even always intentional, but incidentally teaches us that, like, Jesus first, other people second, then us. Then whatever's left over is ours. And we're putting everyone ahead of us. But when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, he's not putting us on a lower level. He's saying, treat other people like you want to be treated. And that's the thing. That's the thing that we misconstrue. So, it basically, value other people as much as you value yourself. That assumes that you have value for yourself. And if we're conditioned to not, then we're more inclined to put other people leagues ahead of us because we don't care about ourselves. Why? Because we're conditioned to. We're conditioned to not care about ourselves. We're conditioned to not see value in ourselves. My entire ministry in the past 10 years has been over and over again to say the words, look, you have value. God died for you. Jesus was sent by God, God in human form, to die, to suffer and die, and then be resurrected for you, for your salvation. And that's not a small thing. Even if you just look at it in terms of God literally looking at you and saying, I'm willing to die for you. I can't. I physically can't do it. But I'm willing to. And this is my illustration. This is my story. This is my means of making a part of myself to illustrate how much you matter to me. We're conditioned to see ourselves as nothing. And a lot of those different problems, like depression, for example, is fed by our perspective, by our view of ourselves. And yes, there are some people where it's like a brain chemistry thing, and that's fine. We're not talking about that kind of disability. We're talking about the emotional thing, the mental thing. So if you are constantly viewing yourself as meaningless, as invalid, as nothing, and you're going to God and viewing yourself that way when he's over here viewing you as like a prince or princess of the kingdom of God. You have very different perspectives and very different ideas of what your value is. See, we should all be able to take joy in ourselves and who we are. And this is the thing about conditioning. So even if we've been conditioned to hate ourselves, as most of us have been, I mean, you know, we did talk about this to some extent, about depression, about different components, and we talked about the way that, like, so much of the world is built around conditioning us to hate ourselves, to devalue ourselves, to debase ourselves. The thing that we run into, though, is that if we're conditioned to only function that way, we then need to be willing to surrender that perspective, that viewpoint. We need to be able to surrender our self-identification to God in order that he can offer us a new perspective. If you only see yourself as garbage, but the God of heaven and earth sees you as something beautiful and worth dying for, you're never going to be able to reconcile those two perspectives, because he will always push for the best for you and you will always turn it down. You will always fight with him. You'll tell him he's wrong about who you are. And that will always create strife. We all want heaven, but we've created this mentality of heaven as being something that's so far off. When you literally have Jesus saying, the kingdom of God is in your midst. You carry it with you. It's part of you. It's not far off. It's only far off because we believe it's far off, because we're conditioned to think it's far off. We're conditioned to think that God's not there. We're conditioned to believe that God doesn't care. We're conditioned in all these different ways, and it leaves us vulnerable and weak and helpless. We're like sheep that have been blinded to the shepherd that's right there. And as a result, we have all these dysfunctions, all these things that break us down and cause us to not be able to think, to not be able to see, to not be able to feel ourselves and the people around us, to not be able to value ourselves. We look at ourselves as monsters. We create these false images of ourselves. They look like something that a child drew for Halloween. But in reality, it's not us. And it doesn't have to remain us. And therein lies this place of being willing to relinquish our certainty about who we are, to let God speak to us about who we are. To put it bluntly, all these things that we've talked about over the last couple of months are things that stop us from seeing ourselves and maintain a conditioning that helps us stay there and only see us in see ourselves in that particular way. And as a result, it creates a false identity. It creates a false perception. Now, it's why it's a sickness. It's why it's dysfunction. To have depression is to have a dysfunction within your mind and soul. To have narcissism is to have a dysfunction in your mind and soul. To have trauma is to have damage to your mind and soul. The healer would aim to be there for you and to bring healing into those places. But what we struggle with is the faith that God will do that. And it's not even that we have to have the faith to believe that he's going to do it. What it is that we have to have the faith that he could. And that's all you need to start. And we oftentimes struggle with even that much. Because we're conditioned to only believe in what we can do with our hands. You have to take initiative. You have to take control. You have to fix this. You have to do this. We're told that every day. It's considered being an adult. But God calls us to be children, his children. So yeah, we're going to have to drop our hammers a little bit. We're going to have to stop being the Marthas who are running around preparing for God and start being the Marys who actually just stop and sit with him and be close to him. Because in the end, if we all remember that story, that's what he valued most. See, this is the thing, the keystone of this message. We could have continued talking on and on about the different things that condition us. But the reality of it is that they don't matter. They only matter in regards to you recognizing what is holding you back and what is stopping you from having that relationship, from having that comfort, from being able to face the things of this day and of this life with the strength and faith and knowledge of knowing who you are. Because all of these things that we've talked about, whether it's Dunning-Kruger making you think that you are better than you actually are, or narcissism, where, dear Lord, like that mess, you think that you find yourself thinking that you're so vastly superior to everything else while needing those things you think you're superior to validate you. Whether it's depression, where you can't even see the light or the colors of life anymore. Or, we could go on. In all of these particular things, though, in everything that we've talked about, I mean, imposter syndrome, trauma, in all of these things that bind us to a certain way of seeing things, of seeing the world and seeing ourselves, they stop us from seeing God, and they hold us back from being the whole, the true versions of ourselves, because they make us feel helpless and hopeless. And what's more is when they hold us in that place, we eventually just get used to being there. And that's why we're talking about conditioning, because we're all too used to being in pain. We're all too used to suffering. We're so used to it that we don't even feel it anymore. It's just normal. And we need God to open our eyes to the fact that we need to see something different, that we can feel different, that we can be different, that we can be okay. That there can be other ways of life and living, that our experiences are not the shapers of reality. They shape our perception of reality, but they do not shape reality. If I'm colorblind and I see that the sky is a shade of green, that doesn't mean that the sky is a shade of green. It only means it's a shade of green to me because I can't see right. The prism effect makes it blue for everyone else. And God can correct our vision. And that is our way out in terms of conditioning. To be reconditioned. To be born again. To have our minds be renewed. To have our hearts renewed. These facets of life, of existence, especially as followers of Jesus, are some of the most important things for us to grab a hold of and to really make our own. God is our Father. He built this world for us and for himself. And then we made choices and that we broke it. And yet he's continued to be our Father, and he's continued to be there, and he's continued to try to draw us close to him. And we've continued to fall into every trap that's laid out by the enemy. We've continued to hurt ourselves and each other. We've continued to live a life that is separate from him while trying to please him. We claim that we live for him, but we don't live with him. And that's incredibly odd to me. It's odd to think that we can be so certain that we are for God when we're not even with him. And yet he's right there. This is where we need to be reconditioned to have a new way, a new path to walk down. And that's what we'll be praying for tonight. That's what I got.